Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about demand, we've talked about supply, now let's put it all together. And this is going to be important because in this course we're talking about markets. We talk about markets because that's how we, in a capitalist society, allocate our resources. So in order to understand markets, we have to understand what forces are at work within them. And here are our two forces. We have supply acting with demand to generate something. And what supply and demand together generate is something called equilibrium. Equilibrium is a combination of price and quantity. And in this instance, and we're talking about the market for lattes, which isn't shown, we have $3 and a quantity of 15 as our equilibrium. And this is a special point, and there are no other equilibrium in this graph. The reason this is our equilibrium is because at this price, the choice made by producers and the choice made by consumers is exactly the same. Producers want to sell 15 units at $3. We know that because supply represents their choices, their tastes and preferences for supplying a good. At $3, they want to supply 15. And demand represents the choice and tastes and preferences of consumers. And we see that quantity demanded for a $3 latte, it's 15. That equality means we are at equilibrium. What we're going to do to find equilibrium is just look for the intersection of supply and demand. But we can find it another way, and here's where we're going to see it. If we have this table, in other words, it's a schedule, we can establish an equilibrium price by finding the price where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. 3 is our equilibrium price because the quantity, 15 for quantity demanded, and the quantity, 15 for quantity supplied, are equal to one another. So 15 is our equilibrium quantity. Unfortunately, we are often in a state of disequilibrium. We have either a surplus or, and we'll talk about this in a second, a shortage. Surplus you might find described in another way as excess supply. It's when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. You will find that you have a surplus if you are at any price above the equilibrium. So they give an example of 5 and we'll analyze why we have a surplus here. Remember, demand represents the choice, the tastes and preferences for lattes at each and every price. Supply, the tastes and preferences for producing lattes at every price. So we have a single price here, it's $5. What is the choice by our consumers? They want 9 lattes. We see that by the intersection of these dots. 9 lattes are desired when the price is 5. However, when that price is quite high, you find a lot of people willing and able to produce those lattes. It's 25. What do you see there? You see that quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. We call that, in short, a surplus. This is a situation that will not persist. Shortages and surpluses will eventually naturally work themselves out because producers are not going to want to sit there with 16 lattes perishing. That's waste. So what are they going to do to get rid of those 16 lattes? The only thing they can do is cut the price. When they cut the price, perhaps to 4, it does change people's behavior. We find that quantity demanded does indeed rise, predictably so, and we find that actually a few people who were producing lattes are going to get out of the business because it's just not worth it to them. $4 isn't enough. So when we reduce the price, we find that we've reduced the surplus. But given this instance, we haven't eliminated it. So we're going to find that the observation is price is going to continue to fall until the market reaches equilibrium until we get to $3. But that's just one instance of disequilibrium. We can also have a shortage, another example of disequilibrium, and there's another way to call it. It's excess demand. Quantity demanded is going to exceed quantity supplied. Where can we find these? At any price below the equilibrium. For example, 1. Why do we have a shortage? Well, let's look at the tastes and preferences for lattes on consumer side and producer side at $1, a hypothetical price. Quantity demanded is quite high, 21 lattes. There's a lot of people who formerly weren't buying at 5 who now say, you know what, a latte is worth $1 to me. But now that the price is so low, you've pushed out a lot of people who were formerly making lattes. It's just not worth their time. 5 lattes are made, 21 are desired. That leaves us with a shortage of 16. And again, this is going to naturally work itself out, because when you have 21 customers in line and you only have 5 of those products, eventually the price is going to get bid up until you have an equality between how many you have and how many people want. So let's look at what happens if we raise the price to 2. What happens to the size of our shortage? Well, quantity demand does indeed fall, because we now have people who wanted it at $1 who just don't value it at 2. So you push some people out of the market on the consumer side. And some producers you now enticed either to make more, or you brought new individuals into making this. Indeed, shortage did get reduced, but it didn't get eliminated. It will not get eliminated until you reach that equilibrium price of $3. Final thing we're going to do here is we're going to have a 3-step process to analyze events and how they affect supply and demand directly, and then how indirectly they affect price and quantity. So let's look at the 3 steps that we have. First step, we have to decide whether it affects supply or demand. That's the first step. Second step is which direction supply or demand are going to shift. The third step is when we shift supply and demand, or both, how is price and quantity impacted? This right here is going to be your task for the AP. The College Board asks you to analyze what happens given a certain event to price and quantity. Have to be able to do it. So let's practice. First market we're talking about is for hybrid vehicles. Things that are more fuel efficient than your ordinary vehicle. You have price, you have quantity, and again, price and quantity of hybrid vehicles. First curve that we want to draw, downward sloping demand. Second curve, upward sloping supply. And we have our original equilibrium. This is the price where the market clears. Remember that phrase. We clear the market because everyone who wants to sell a car at this price gets to sell it. There's somebody out there, a willing buyer at that price, and there's a marriage between willing buyers and willing producers. No one is left unsatisfied. We have no surplus or no shortage. But what happens when we have some event? Our event being an increase in the price of gas. First thing you need to do, first step, is whether this affects demand or supply. 5 things affect demand. Number of buyers, the change in the price of a related good, change in tastes and preferences, changes in expectation, and then changes in income. 3 things that affect supply: technology, input costs, and number of sellers. Number of sellers, and then finally expectations. That can also be the case. So what is this going to do? Affect supply or demand, or both? Well, what we see is this actually affects demand, because the price of gasoline is going to change your tastes and preferences for hybrid vehicles. Those more fuel-efficient cars are going to be more desired by the markets. You might say, is supply affected? It is not, because supply is the curve here. You might think the gasoline is an input in the vehicle. No. We use gasoline once the vehicle is produced, but this curve represents the production of those vehicles. So an input, for example, would be the steel. Maybe they're the wages of the employees we're paying. So the supply curve does not change. Inputs, technology, expectations, number of suppliers did not get affected. So the next thing to do would be determine where this curve is shifting. We already established this. More people want these cars. So we find demand is going to shift right. It's going to increase. Now, the question is, how does this affect price and quantity? Here we go. Real quick. This is our original equilibrium, because that's the old taste and preferences for hybrids and the production possibilities on the part of supply. Now this is moot, doesn't exist anymore. This is people's tastes and preferences. If the price is 1, look at how many people want that good. What would you call that? You would call this a, and sorry, I did that wrong, and that looks a little weird. I'm going to go back and, there we go. This is called a shortage. So what happens when we have a shortage? Where does price go? Price goes up. So what we find is that the shift causes an increase in the price. The price is going to go up to the new intersection of supply and the new demand curve. And what happened to quantity? So this is what I need you to do. Trace down to the axes. Quantity increased. Price increased. And right over here, P increase, Q increase. That's what the AP is going to ask for. That's what we just did. Example number 2. Sorry. Yes. Nope. Sorry. Oh, they have an understanding here. It says, when the price rises, producers supply a larger quantity of hybrids. You might be inclined to say that the increase in demand caused an increase in supply. It didn't. What happens here is we went from here to here. We moved along an existing supply curve. We didn't shift supply. And that is what we say when it increases. So here are some very important terms for you to understand. I'm just going to make a couple of comments here because you can see this all and you can pause it. A change in supply is a shift in the entire curve. A change in supply does not happen because of a change in demand. A change in the quantity supplied will happen because of a change in demand. So a change in the entire curve, in this instance demand, will cause a movement along the other curve. The one does not cause the other. We already talked about the 5 things that shift demand and the 4 that shift supply. So, let's go to our next example here. New technology makes the cost of producing hybrid vehicles lower. What do you think that affects? I hope we can say that new technology is going to affect supply. It affects our ability to produce these goods. What we find is that the supply curve is going to be the one that shifts. Demand is going to be stagnant. Those 5 things that I mentioned aren't in play here. Cost of the good going down in terms of the technology reducing the cost of production does not affect demand. So now we determined which one. The question is now, which way? We are going to say, step 2, shift right. The reason why it shifts right is because it's now easier to make these vehicles. And a key insight here, sorry, I need to go back. At each price now, so if this is still the price, it didn't cost them this much money to produce it. It cost them less. They got, it was easier for them to produce this. It cost them less time, less money. And thus, at this price, if they charge that to consumers, they're making more profits. So at each and every price, they are more profitable because of the new technology. Therefore, they have a greater willingness to sell at each and every price. So now the question is, what happens to price and quantity? Well, as you can see here, if this is the price, this is their ability to supply now. They're willing and able to supply this many units at that price. But demand for that good just doesn't exist. You would say this is a surplus. Now, how in the world do we get rid of a surplus? The only way that we can is we reduce the price. And you can see it right here. Price goes down and we sell more units. P went up and Q went down. That's what we have to do for the College Board to prove that we can analyze supply and demand and talk about price changes. Now the last thing, let's put it all together. Price of gas goes up and new technology is invented. How does this affect supply and demand and then price and quantity? Well, as we established earlier, both of these curves are now going to shift. Supply is going to increase, as is demand. So step 1, we already did it. Both curves shift. Both curves are going to shift to the right. So now the last question, this is the one that's important. What in the heck happens to price? Well, as I showed you earlier, cross out those things that are moot now. We don't need S1 and D1 now. We already have the original equilibrium. The question is just now, how does price and quantity change? In order to figure that out, we need to come up here. This is our new supply curve and this is our new demand curve. As you can see, quantity increased, absolutely. And it looks like price increased. But, wait for it, they say that actually step 3 is the quantity rose but the price change was ambiguous. We couldn't determine it. Now how in the world can that be? Well, it's because they drew these curves, or the shifts in them, in an arbitrary fashion. The size of them does matter. Here it looks like price increased. Give me a moment, I'm going to erase all this. Okay, so I'm going to erase all this. Do so quickly. And I'm going to show you a different way of doing this. I'm going to go back. So now, let's take a look. If I draw a big supply increase, which might have happened, take a look at what happened to quantity. Absolutely, it's increasing. There's no way that I could draw that supply shift that quantity doesn't go up. But take a look now at what happened to price. Price actually went down. And it's because the supply shift was larger than the demand shift. So when they shift in this fashion, the price change is going to be ambiguous or indeterminate. Tuck that away, don't forget it. You have to know which way curves are shifting and then look at the new supply and new demand curve, look at their intersection and compare price and quantity. That is Chapter 4.